tonight drift back into a world that existed for 160 million years and was stranger, more extreme, and more poorly understood than almost anyone realizes. The facts that get taught about dinosaurs are often incomplete, outdated, or quietly wrong in ways that change the entire picture. This is the real history of dinosaurs, the unexplained structures, the collapsed assumptions, and the questions that the fossil record still hasn't answered. There is a version of Earth that most people have never seriously tried to picture. Not the Earth of ancient Rome, not the Earth of the first human settlements, not even the Earth of the earliest stone tools, but an Earth so far back in time that the geography itself would be unrecognizable. The continents were in different positions. The oceans were shaped differently. The air had a different composition, and the animals moving across that landscape were unlike anything walking the planet today. Most people know that dinosaurs disappeared 66 million years ago, but that date is only one end of the story. The other end reaches back far enough that the world dinosaurs were born into and the world they died in were separated by changes so complete in climate, in geography, in the composition of ecosystems that they barely resemble the same planet. What sits between those 2 points is not a single era, but a vast, largely uncharted stretch of biological time that the fossil record has only partially recovered. The question worth sitting with isn't just what dinosaurs looked like or how large they grew. It's how a group of animals managed to persist and keep diversifying across conditions that have ended most lineages long before they reached anything close to that scale. The persistence itself is the starting point. The scale of it is where this story begins. But here is where the scale starts to work against easy understanding. The number 160 million years is large enough that the human brain processes it the same way it processes any number too big to visualize. It registers as impressive and then slides off without leaving a real impression. People hear it, nod, and move on. The problem is that moving on is exactly what makes the rest of the dinosaur story harder to follow. Because almost every fact that comes after depends on genuinely holding that span of time in mind rather than acknowledging it and letting it go. But the difficulty isn't laziness, it's a structural limitation. The human mind developed to track time across days, seasons, and a handful of generations. Anything beyond a few centuries starts to flatten out. Ancient Rome and the Jurassic period feel qualitatively similar because neither is within reach of lived experience. The fossil record doesn't help with this as much as it should, because what it presents is a collection of endpoints without the continuous texture of time between them. A skeleton in a museum gives no sense of the millions of years of ordinary life that surrounded it. But what that flattening conceals is motion. The Mesozoic wasn't a static backdrop. It was a world in constant geological and biological flux, where the conditions that allowed one group of dinosaurs to dominate could disappear within a few million years and be replaced by conditions that favored something else entirely. What the fossil record gives us is a fraction of what actually existed, weighted toward accidents of geology rather than toward any representative picture of life across that span. What sits in the gaps between known specimens is, for the most part, permanently gone. The scale of dinosaur dominance isn't just a number worth memorizing. It's a fact that changes how every other fact in this story lands. 160 million years is not a long reign. It is an almost incomprehensible stretch of geological time during which dinosaurs didn't simply survive, but diversified into thousands of forms, colonized every continent, filled every ecological role, from apex predator to bottom-feeding browser, and did all of this across conditions that shifted so dramatically the Earth they died on barely resembled the Earth they were born into. Continents split apart beneath their feet. Oceans opened where dry land had been. Climates swung from pole to pole warmth to seasonal ice. Dinosaurs didn't just endure those changes, they kept evolving through them. What makes this scale genuinely difficult to absorb is that human civilization, every empire, every written language, every war, every city ever built, has unfolded across roughly 10,000 years. That is not a rounding error compared to 160 million years. It is essentially zero. The Roman Empire, which people tend to treat as ancient, lasted about 5 centuries. Dinosaurs outlasted it by a factor of 300,000. The entire human story, from the first scratched symbols on cave walls to everything happening right now, would vanish inside a single geological eye blink of the Mesozoic. When paleontologists say dinosaurs were successful, they don't mean successful the way a company has a good quarter. They mean successful the way life itself is successful, persisting, adapting, filling space that nothing else could fill. The dinosaurs we know from museums represent only a fraction of the species that existed. Most never left a recoverable fossil. Most lived and died without a single bone surviving to be found. What we have is a partial inventory of something far larger, stranger, and longer lived than the exhibits suggest, and most of what actually existed left nothing behind at all. If this is helping you wind down, a like takes 1 second and helps more people find their way here. Back to the story. The animal we just described, one of the most successful vertebrate lineages that has ever existed, was named after something it had almost nothing in common with. The word dinosaur has been in use for nearly 2 centuries, and from the moment it was coined, it pointed in the wrong direction. What the name got wrong, and how deeply that mistake shaped everything that followed, is what the name's history eventually reveals. The word itself came first, and it shaped everything that followed. When the fossils started turning up in England in the early 19th century, enormous bones, unlike anything anyone had catalogued, the scientists examining them reached for the closest comparison they had. The bones were reptilian in character. The animals had clearly been large. The assumption that followed felt reasonable at the time. These must have been giant versions of the reptiles already known to science. That assumption produced a name, a framework, and a mental image that lodged itself in popular understanding for well over a century. Museum illustrations from the late 1800s depicted ponderous, earthbound creatures, interpretations built entirely on that first assumption rather than on the anatomy. School textbooks carried those illustrations forward. Films reinforced them. The image became the default picture that most people carried without questioning it. The problem is that the comparison was wrong from the start. Not slightly off, but wrong in ways that affect almost every aspect of how these animals lived. Lizards and dinosaurs shared a distant common ancestor, the way humans and fish share a distant common ancestor. But that relationship says almost nothing about biology, behavior, or body plan. What actually separated dinosaurs from every reptile alive today was structural, metabolic, and deeply embedded in how they were built, from the skeleton outward. And the fossil record, once scientists started looking at it with the right questions, told a story completely different from the one the name implied. But the name didn't just stick, it calcified. By the time the evidence against it began accumulating seriously in the mid-20th century, the word dinosaur had already been embedded in 2 generations of popular culture, educational materials, and museum design. Changing what scientists understood about the animals was one problem. Changing what the public understood was a different problem entirely, and the 2 processes moved at completely different speeds. But the resistance wasn't only cultural. Some of it came from within paleontology itself. The idea that dinosaurs might have been warm-blooded, metabolically active, and physiologically closer to birds than to lizards was considered fringe thinking well into the 1970s and 1980s. When Robert Barker argued in print that dinosaurs were more like large active mammals than like oversized crocodilians, the response from parts of the scientific community was dismissive. The conventional view had decades of institutional weight behind it, and the evidence for warm-bloodedness was indirect enough that it could be contested. But the deeper problem is that the original name did more than mislabel a group of animals. It created a cognitive frame that made certain questions harder to ask. If a dinosaur is, by definition, a kind of lizard, slow, cold, primitive, then asking whether it had complex social behavior, or whether it regulated its own body temperature, or whether it could move with sustained agility over long distances, feels like it's asking the wrong kind of question. The name shaped what seemed worth investigating, and what didn't get investigated for decades because of that framing is something the field is still working to recover. What paleontology eventually confirmed is that the word dinosaur was built on a mistake, and the mistake ran deep. When Richard Owen coined the term in 1842, he was working from 3 partial fossil sets: Megalosaurus, Iguanodon, and Hylaeosaurus. From those fragments, he inferred large, land-dwelling reptiles and assumed they resembled the lizards and crocodilians he already knew. The name stuck. The assumption didn't survive. Dinosaurs stood with their legs directly beneath their bodies, the same architecture found in mammals and birds, not in lizards or crocodiles. A lizard's legs splay outward from the torso, which limits how much weight the body can carry and how efficiently the animal can move across long distances. Dinosaurs had a fully erect posture, which meant their skeletal frame could support far greater mass, their muscles could operate with far greater mechanical efficiency, and their breathing could continue unimpeded while they moved. That last point matters more than it might seem. Sprawling reptiles today actually struggle to breathe and run at the same time because the lateral movement of their torso compresses their lungs. Dinosaurs didn't have that problem. Their respiratory system was also built on a completely different plan. Many dinosaurs, particularly the theropods, had air sac systems similar to modern birds, a one-way flow of air through the lungs that extracted oxygen far more efficiently than the in-out breathing of mammals. Their bones were frequently hollow and connected to these air sacs, reducing weight while maintaining structural strength. Their growth rates were closer to warm-blooded animals than to the slow, temperature-dependent growth of modern reptiles. The fossil record now shows bone growth rings in some species consistent with rapid, sustained growth, not the stop-start pattern of a cold-blooded animal waiting for the temperature to rise. The creature Owen imagined, a bloated, sluggish, overgrown lizard dragging itself through swamps, was wrong in almost every measurable way. Dinosaurs were closer, physiologically, to the birds that descend from them than to any reptile alive today. The name has persisted for nearly 2 centuries, not because it's accurate, but because it arrived first. So, the name was wrong, and the biology behind it was wrong. and science spent the better part of a century working to correct both. But there's a second assumption that survived even longer, one that has nothing to do with the name and everything to do with size. When most people picture a dinosaur, the image that forms is large, probably very large. What the fossil record actually shows is something the museum floor never quite prepares you for. And the smallest end of that record is where things get genuinely strange. Ask most people to close their eyes and picture a dinosaur, and the image that appears will almost certainly be large. Probably very large. The creatures that dominate museum halls, film franchises, and children's books are the ones that command attention through scale. Animals whose bones have to be suspended from steel cables just to hold their shape in an exhibit. Those animals existed, they were real, and their size was genuine, but they were not representative of the dinosaur lineage as a whole. The fossil record is filled with species small enough that no large animal could have followed them into the environments they occupied. These weren't juveniles or hatchlings caught at an early growth stage. They were fully mature adults of species that simply never grew large, animals whose smallness was a biological strategy rather than a limitation. They moved through spaces the giants couldn't access, exploited food sources the giants couldn't reach, and survived in ecosystems that would have been completely invisible to anything measured in tons. For a long time, these smaller dinosaurs received comparatively little attention. Partial skeletons were harder to display. Incomplete fossils were harder to study. The popular narrative around dinosaurs had been built around size for so long that anything small enough to hold in two hands felt like a footnote rather than a subject. But as fossil preparation techniques improved, and sites in China began yielding spectacularly preserved, small-bodied specimens in the 1990s and 2000s, that picture started shifting in ways paleontologists hadn't fully anticipated. But the shift created its own complications. The more specimens came out of Liaoning and similar sites, the more they challenged assumptions that had seemed settled. Small feathered dinosaurs didn't fit neatly into the existing picture of dinosaur evolution. They were too diverse, too varied in their feathering, and too geographically concentrated to be explained by a single straightforward evolutionary pathway. Some showed configurations that had no obvious modern equivalent. Some appeared to have had coloration patterns that served no obvious survival function, which raised questions about behavior that the bones alone couldn't answer. But the question that proved hardest to settle was also the most basic one. Which of these animals could actually fly, and which couldn't? One of the most studied small feathered specimens had feathered hind limbs as well as forelimbs, producing an aerodynamic configuration unlike anything seen in living birds. Some researchers argued it could glide effectively. Others argued it was capable of powered flight. Still, others suggested the hind limb feathers created drag rather than lift, making the animal less aerodynamic than a comparable animal without them, which raised the question of why the feathers were there at all. But what the small-bodied dinosaurs most disrupted wasn't the science of flight. It was the assumed relationship between size and ecological importance. For most of the history of dinosaur research, the large-bodied species had been treated as the primary story, with everything else positioned as context or background. The Liaoning specimens suggested that was an artifact of which fossils happened to survive and which happened to be found, not a reflection of how Mesozoic ecosystems actually worked. Small dinosaurs weren't marginal. They were occupying a completely separate layer of the food web simultaneously, and the record of what they were doing there had barely been touched. What the fossil record actually shows is a size range so extreme that lumping all dinosaurs into a single mental image is nearly meaningless. Microraptor guy, discovered in China and dated to roughly 120 million years ago, weighed somewhere between 1 and 2 pounds. It was roughly 2 feet long, feathered across all 4 limbs, and almost certainly capable of some form of gliding or short-distance flight between trees. Its feathers, studied under ultraviolet light and electron microscopy, showed microscopic structures consistent with iridescent black coloring, the same structural feature found in modern starlings. This was not a dull, grey, scaly creature. It was closer in appearance to a glossy, dark-winged bird than to anything most people picture when they hear the word dinosaur. Anchiornis, another small feathered dinosaur from the same period and region, was even lighter. Some estimates place it under 100 grams, which is lighter than a standard mobile phone. It had feathers on its legs as well as its arms, and its wing feathers were black and white, with patches of reddish-brown on the head. Paleontologists determined this using the same method used for Microraptor, analyzing individual melanosomes preserved within the fossilized feathers and matching their shape and arrangement to those of modern birds with known colors. These animals weren't evolutionary dead ends or early failed attempts at something larger. They were specialists. Small size meant they could exploit food sources no large dinosaur could reach. Insects in dense forest undergrowth, small vertebrates hiding in root systems, fruit and seeds in the upper canopy. The diversity at the small end of the dinosaur spectrum was not a gap before the giants arrived. It was a permanent ecological feature of Mesozoic ecosystems, running in parallel with the large-bodied species for millions of years. The giants get the museum floor space. The small ones were, in many ways, doing more interesting things. The small feathered dinosaurs occupied a layer of the Mesozoic that most people never think about. Agile, specialized, ecologically distinct from the giants that dominated the popular image. But the giants themselves are worth looking at more carefully because some of them push the boundaries of what a body can physically be built to do. One in particular built a structure so extreme that every model designed to explain it has so far produced more questions than answers. That structure has never been fully explained. It still hasn't. Among the sauropods, the long-necked, long-tailed giants that roamed the Jurassic and Cretaceous, there was already an extraordinary range of neck lengths. Some species had necks proportionate enough to seem almost conventional for an animal that size. Others pushed the proportion further, trading torso length for cervical length in ways that required increasingly unusual skeletal solutions to keep the structure from collapsing under its own weight. But one genus, found in what is now China, took that tendency to an extreme that no other vertebrate in the history of life on Earth has matched. Mamenchisaurus was not the largest dinosaur by overall body mass. It was not the longest by total body length. What set it apart was the proportion, a neck so disproportionate to the rest of the body that early researchers examining the fossils struggled to accept that the bones belonged to a single animal. The vertebrae were elongated to a degree that seemed to violate practical limits. Each one was longer than anything found in comparable sauropods, stacked into a structure that extended well beyond the midpoint of the animal's total length. The obvious question, why, doesn't have a clean answer. Long necks in sauropods are generally assumed to have provided feeding advantages, allowing the animal to reach vegetation across a wider area without moving its body. But there are physical constraints on neck length that become increasingly difficult to overcome as the structure gets longer. Blood pressure, nerve signal travel time, muscular support requirements, and the sheer mechanical load of holding the structure off the ground all scale in ways that work against extreme length. Mamenchisaurus appears to have pushed past those constraints regardless. How it managed, that is where the science gets complicated. But the feeding advantage explanation, even taken at face value, doesn't resolve the physics. A neck that extends 30 or more feet from the body creates leverage problems that increase exponentially with length. Holding that structure even partially off the ground requires muscular force applied at an enormous mechanical disadvantage. The further the neck extends, the more force is needed at the base just to maintain position, let alone move. Engineers who have modeled the mechanical loads involved have found that the musculature required to operate Mamenchisaurus's neck in anything resembling an active posture would have been extraordinary, and the fossil record of where those muscles attached doesn't fully account for that requirement. But the cardiovascular problem is, if anything, more difficult. The giraffe is the closest living analog for thinking about the relationship between neck length and blood pressure, and Mamenchisaurus's neck dwarfed that analog so completely that the comparison barely holds. The vertical distance blood would need to travel if the neck was held at any significant upward angle would have demanded either a heart of implausible scale or a supplementary pumping mechanism that left no fossil evidence. Some researchers have proposed that Mamenchisaurus kept its neck nearly horizontal at all times, specifically to avoid this problem. But a fully horizontal neck of that length creates its own mechanical complications and doesn't obviously explain why the neck needed to be that long in the first place. But the deepest difficulty is that every model built to explain Mamenchisaurus's neck has been built from incomplete material. The genus is known from multiple specimens, but no single specimen is complete enough to resolve all the structural questions simultaneously. What's known about the vertebrae, the musculature attachment points, and the overall body proportions comes from piecing together evidence across several individuals, none of which preserves everything needed to answer the central questions cleanly. The neck remains the most extreme structure in vertebrate history and, for now, one of the least explained. What Mamenchisaurus represents is not just a record, it's a biological puzzle that paleontologists have been working on for decades without reaching a clean answer. The neck stretched somewhere between 30 and 50 feet, depending on the species within the genus, making up roughly half the animal's total body length. Supporting that structure required a series of vertebrae elongated far beyond anything else in the fossil record, each one hollowed out by air sacs to reduce weight without sacrificing the structural support the neck needed to hold itself off the ground. How blood reached the brain remains one of the genuinely unresolved questions. A neck that long, held even partially upright, would have required a heart powerful enough to pump blood against gravity across an extraordinary vertical distance. Estimates for the blood pressure required, based on comparisons with modern giraffes and sauropods with better studied neck mechanics, suggest Mamenchisaurus may have needed a heart weighing several hundred kilograms just to keep blood circulating to the head. Whether that heart existed and how the cardiovascular system compensated for postural changes is not known. What posture the animal actually used day to day is also unsettled. Early reconstructions showed sauropods holding their necks nearly vertical, like a giraffe. Later biomechanical analysis suggested the neck was held more horizontally, sweeping side to side across low vegetation like a living harvesting machine. More recent work has pushed back on that model too, suggesting the neck was flexible enough for both postures, depending on what the animal was doing. The honest answer to how Mamenchisaurus used its neck is that no one fully knows, and every model that seems to settle the question tends to create a new problem somewhere else in physics. The neck is extraordinary. It is also, still, genuinely unexplained. Mamenchisaurus left behind a neck that science still can't fully account for, a structure preserved in bone but not yet understood in biology. Most fossils are like that. They record the shape of something without recording the life inside it. But occasionally, a fossil records a moment so specific, so frozen in detail, that it forces entirely new questions about behavior that researchers thought they'd already answered. One specimen from Argentina did exactly that, and the question it left behind has no confirmed answer. Fossils, as a general rule, record the end result. A bone survives, mineralizes over millions of years, and eventually reaches the surface where someone finds it. What the bone can tell about the life of the animal that owned it is usually limited. Age, approximate size, sometimes evidence of injury or disease. The specific circumstances of death are almost never preserved. The moment itself is almost always lost. Occasionally, the rock holds more than bones. A nest with eggs still inside. Footprints in hardened mud that record the direction and gait of an animal moving through a landscape 100 million years gone. And, rarely, something more specific. A predator caught in a position that preserves not just the skeleton, but a snapshot of what it was doing in its final moments. These specimens are exceptional precisely because they give paleontologists something the fossil record almost never offers: context. The specimen recovered from Patagonia presented researchers with exactly that kind of context, and what it revealed cut against several assumptions about predator behavior that had been treated as reasonably settled. The animal had been large, well-armed, and by every structural measure, a top predator in the ecosystem it occupied. What was preserved alongside its teeth was the detail that made the specimen unusual. Not another herbivore, not a smaller animal, but something that should, by conventional assumptions, have been difficult prey. The find raised two questions at once. The first was what this predator had been hunting. The second, and harder one, was what had stopped it. But the circumstances surrounding the specimen's death have no clean explanation. The site in Patagonia yielded no evidence sufficient to identify what ended the theropod. What was recovered pointed toward a cause without confirming one, leaving the question genuinely open rather than provisionally answered. If something had killed it, the record of that event either wasn't preserved in the same deposit or hasn't been found. But the alternative explanations carry their own problems. If the theropod died of injury sustained during the hunt, a common end for large predators that take on dangerous prey, the skeleton should show some trace of trauma consistent with a struggle. Crocodilians are not passive prey. A large late Cretaceous crocodilian would have been capable of inflicting serious injury on an attacking theropod, particularly if the initial strike failed to incapacitate it. The skeletal evidence doesn't point definitively to combat injury as the cause of death, which leaves that hypothesis open but unconfirmed. But what makes the fossil genuinely strange is the detail of timing. Death came not before the hunt, not long after it, but at the precise moment between a successful kill and the completion of eating. That specificity is almost never preserved in the fossil record, and finding it here raises a question the specimen itself cannot answer. Whatever killed this predator was fast enough and consequential enough to end an animal that had just demonstrated it could take down dangerous prey, but left no trace of itself in the sediment. The meal is preserved. The cause of death is not. What this fossil preserved wasn't just a dramatic moment. It was direct physical evidence of a predator behavior that had previously been inferred but never confirmed so concretely. The specimen, recovered from Patagonia and dated to approximately 70 million years ago, was a large theropod with a crocodile limb wedged between its teeth at the time of death. The preservation was precise enough that paleontologists could identify the prey species, confirm the theropod had been actively consuming it, and determine that death came before the meal was finished. What the fossil confirmed is that some large theropods actively hunted other predators rather than restricting themselves to herbivores. Crocodilians of the late Cretaceous were not small. They were formidable animals in their own right, and taking one down would have required both capability and calculated risk. The presence of the crocodile limb between the teeth, rather than in the stomach, suggests the theropod had only just begun to eat when it died. Whatever ended it, a rival predator, injury sustained during the hunt, environmental cause, acted fast. The question the fossil raises and doesn't answer is what killed an animal at the top of its food chain in the middle of a successful hunt. No remains of a competing predator were found at the site. No obvious trauma to the skeleton has been reported as a definitive cause of death. The fossil is, in the most literal sense, a crime scene without a confirmed suspect, a moment frozen at the point of maximum ambiguity, with no record of what completed that reversal. A predator that hunted other predators, an apex animal caught mid-kill with no clear record of what ended it. The Patagonian specimen collapsed assumptions about what large theropods hunted and how they did it. But that specimen isn't the only large theropod whose behavior turned out to be completely different from what the evidence initially suggested. The most famous predator in the history of paleontology has been studied longer, more intensively, and by more researchers than almost any other dinosaur. And the version of it that came out of that research looks almost nothing like the one in the films. For most of the 20th century, the image of Tyrannosaurus rex was built around threat. The posture shifted over decades, from tail dragging to upright to the forward-leaning stance now considered more accurate. But the core idea remained consistent. This was a pursuit predator, an animal that could close distance fast, overwhelm prey through speed and power, and run down anything it decided to chase. Films depicted it outpacing vehicles. Games built mechanics around its charge. The idea of a running T-Rex became so embedded in the cultural picture of the animal that questioning it felt almost counterintuitive. The questioning started in earnest in the late 1990s and accelerated through the 2000s as computational tools for biomechanical modeling became more sophisticated. Researchers began building detailed mathematical models of T-Rex's skeleton, musculature, and mass distribution, not to challenge the films, but to understand how the animal actually moved. What those models returned consistently was a set of numbers that didn't match the sprinting predator of popular imagination. The leg bones were massive, but mass cuts both ways. More weight means more impact force per stride, and at a certain body size, that force starts to approach the structural limits of bone. The models weren't unanimous, and the debate around T-Rex locomotion is still active. Some researchers argue for slightly faster movement than the most conservative estimates allow. But the ceiling that keeps appearing in the calculations, The point at which running becomes structurally dangerous for an animal of this size has proven difficult to move regardless of which model is used. What those constraints actually meant for how T-Rex hunted is where the picture gets significantly stranger than the films. But if T-Rex couldn't run, the question of how it actually hunted becomes considerably harder to answer. The standard model of large theropod predation, locate prey, close distance through speed, deliver killing bite, doesn't hold if the speed component is removed or severely reduced. What replaces it is less obvious, and the fossil evidence for hunting behavior in T-Rex is almost entirely indirect, inferred from bite marks on prey bones, rather than from any direct record of a hunt in progress. But the ambush hypothesis, which some researchers favor as an alternative to pursuit, predation, has its own difficulties. Ambush hunting typically depends on concealment. The predator positions itself close enough to prey to close the gap before the prey can react. For an animal the size of T-Rex, concealment was almost certainly limited. A 12-ton predator moving through late Cretaceous vegetation would have produced ground vibrations detectable by prey animals at significant distances. The sensory capabilities of hadrosaurs and ceratopsians, the most common large prey species in T-Rex's range, included hearing and potentially seismic sensitivity that would have made a concealed approach extremely difficult. But the scavenger hypothesis, which positions T-Rex primarily as an opportunist feeding on already dead animals rather than killing its own prey, has also never fully satisfied the evidence. The forward-facing eye placement, the bone-crushing bite force, and the olfactory structures visible in T-Rex skull casts are all features more consistent with active predation than with scavenging. Most large modern scavengers have anatomical profiles quite different from T-Rex, and an animal that cannot run cannot conceal itself effectively, and can crush bone with its jaws, occupies an ecological niche that doesn't map cleanly onto anything alive today. The physical limits of what bone at that scale can absorb during locomotion removed one option. What T-Rex used instead remains genuinely contested. What biomechanical research has established is that T-Rex was almost certainly not a pursuit predator in the way popular culture has portrayed it for decades. The calculations, built from bone stress analysis and muscle reconstruction models, consistently show that running, defined as a gait where both feet leave the ground simultaneously, would have imposed forces on the leg bones that exceeded what the skeleton could safely absorb. At a body mass estimated between 8 and 14 tons, depending on the individual, the impact of each stride at running speed would have risked fracturing the femur or tibia outright. What T-Rex could do was walk fast. Estimates cluster around 8 to 12 miles per hour at a brisk walking pace, with some models allowing for slightly faster movement in short bursts. That is not slow for an animal of that size, and it was likely sufficient for the hunting strategies it actually used. The jaw, rather than speed, was its primary killing instrument. Bite force estimates reach somewhere between 8,000 and 12,800 pounds per square inch, enough to crush bone completely. Fossilized hadrosaur and Triceratops bones with T-Rex bite marks show the predator bit through solid bone to access marrow, something that requires sustained, extreme force rather than speed. Its eyes faced forward, giving it a field of binocular vision that would have supported strong depth perception, a trait more consistent with an active hunter than with a scavenger that merely needed to locate a carcass. Whether T-Rex was primarily a hunter or an opportunistic scavenger remains debated. Most researchers now believe it was both, capable of active hunting, but willing to displace other predators from a kill. The version of T-Rex that chases a vehicle across open ground is a cinematic invention. The real animal was slower, heavier, and built around a completely different set of tools than the films suggest. T-Rex, as it turns out, was not a sprinting killer. It was slower than popular culture ever allowed, built around tools far more specific than speed, and still the subject of genuine debate about how it actually hunted. But there's something even more disorienting than what T-Rex could or couldn't do. And it has nothing to do with its anatomy. It has to do with when it lived. The assumption most people carry about which dinosaurs shared the same world is wrong in a way that doesn't just change one fact. It changes the entire shape of the timeline. When people think about the age of dinosaurs, they tend to compress it. The Mesozoic becomes a single era in the imagination, a time when all the famous animals coexisted, competing and predating in the same landscape. Stegosaurus and T-Rex appear in the same books, the same films, the same toy sets. The assumption that they shared a world is almost never stated outright, because it doesn't need to be. The mental image of the Mesozoic builds it in automatically. Geology doesn't work that way. The Mesozoic era spans roughly 186 million years across 3 distinct periods: the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. And the fauna of each period were separated from one another by spans of time that make the entire human story look recent. The animals that roamed the late Jurassic were not the animals of the late Cretaceous. The ecosystems, the dominant species, the predator-prey relationships, and in many cases, the continents themselves had changed substantially between one period and the next. Stegosaurus is a Jurassic animal. T-Rex is Cretaceous. The gap between them, once measured, forces a complete rereading of what the Mesozoic actually was. Not a single prehistoric world populated by a cast of familiar characters, but a succession of distinct eras that shared only the broadest biological inheritance with one another. But the compression of the Mesozoic in the popular imagination has consequences that go beyond factual inaccuracy. It creates the impression that the dinosaur lineage was more static than it actually was, that the same general cast of animals persisted across a long stretch of time with relatively minor variation. And that impression makes it harder to understand what the Mesozoic actually was: a series of distinct biological worlds, each one shaped by different conditions, dominated by different species, and connected to the others only by the thread of evolutionary descent. But even within a single geological period, the variation was enormous. The fauna of the late Jurassic and the fauna of the late Cretaceous were not different versions of the same world. They were different worlds, separated by tens of millions of years of geological change, with different ecological relationships, different dominant species, and in many cases, different continental configurations. Treating them as 2 chapters of the same story understates how completely one world replaced the other between the time Stegosaurus walked and the time T-Rex appeared. But the most disorienting implication of the time gap sits outside the Mesozoic entirely. If Stegosaurus is as ancient to T-Rex as T-Rex is to us, then our intuitions about which dinosaurs count as old and which count as recent are built on a scale that doesn't reflect the actual distances involved. T-Rex, in geological terms, is a recent animal, closer to the present than to Stegosaurus, closer to modern birds than to the first dinosaurs. The popular image places T-Rex near the ancient end of the timeline. The actual timeline places it near the modern end. What this time gap reveals is that the Mesozoic era was not a single world. It was a sequence of entirely different worlds, each one separated from the next by millions of years of change. Stegosaurus lived during the late Jurassic, roughly 155 to 150 million years ago. T-Rex lived during the late Cretaceous, roughly 68 to 66 million years ago. The gap between them, approximately 80 to 85 million years, is longer than the time separating T-Rex from the present day. That means if a T-Rex had somehow encountered a Stegosaurus skeleton, it would have been looking at a fossil as ancient to it as T-Rex fossils are to us. The two animals never occupied the same habitat, never competed for the same prey, and never existed within the same ecosystem at any point. The Jurassic world that Stegosaurus moved through, dominated by enormous sauropods, conifer forests, and shallow inland seas, had already been replaced several times over by the time T-Rex appeared. The continents had shifted, new species had risen and collapsed, entire evolutionary lineages had come and gone between one animal and the other. The mental image of a single age of dinosaurs, populated by all the famous species at once, is not just simplified, it's structurally wrong. The Mesozoic was long enough that the creatures at its beginning and end were as separated in time as we are from T-Rex. Treating them as contemporaries collapses 80 million years of geological history into a single frame, and in doing so, erases most of what actually happened. The Mesozoic wasn't a single world. It was a sequence of distinct eras, each one replacing the last, and the animals that defined one period had often been gone for tens of millions of years by the time the next period's famous species appeared. That kind of deep separation between species is visible in the bones. But one of the most important things the fossil record reveals about how those species were connected across time isn't visible in the skeleton at all. It's visible in the feathers. And what those feathers were actually doing before any dinosaur ever left the ground is something the field is still working to fully understand. The connection between dinosaurs and birds has been one of the most consequential shifts in paleontology over the past 50 years. When the idea was first proposed seriously in the 1960s by John Ostrom, based on his study of Deinonychus, it was controversial enough that some researchers rejected it outright. The conventional view that birds had evolved from a separate, more ancient reptile lineage was deeply established, and the evidence for a dinosaur origin was considered insufficient by many in the field. What changed the debate wasn't a single argument, it was fossils. Beginning in the 1990s, sites in northeastern China's Liaoning province began producing feathered dinosaurs in a quantity and state of preservation that hadn't been seen anywhere before. The feathers weren't impressions or suggestions. They were detailed enough to show individual barbs, color-bearing structures, and in some cases, the attachment points where feathers met skin. The animals wearing them were unmistakably dinosaurs, theropods with the skeletal features of that lineage, not birds, not transitional forms in the sense of being ambiguous, but ground-dwelling predators with fully developed plumage covering their bodies. The question that immediately followed was obvious. If these animals had feathers but couldn't fly, and many of them clearly couldn't, what were the feathers for? The assumption that feathers and flight were the same evolutionary development, but one had produced the other in a straightforward sequence, no longer held once the fossil record showed feathered animals that had no aerodynamic use for what they were carrying. In what sequence the different functions arrived is what the specimens from Liaoning began to answer. But identifying what the feathers were actually for in the animals that had them before flight was possible has proven significantly harder than finding the fossils themselves. Thermal regulation is the most straightforward hypothesis. A layer of feathers would have provided warmth in the same way fur does in mammals. But thermal regulation alone doesn't explain the more elaborate structures found in some ground-dwelling feathered dinosaurs, where the feathers on the arms and tail showed complexity far beyond what keeping warm would require. But display creates its own interpretive problems. If feathers developed partly for visual signaling between members of the same species, then the selection pressure driving their increasing complexity would have been social rather than environmental. Individuals with more elaborate feathers attracting more mates, passing the trait forward at a higher rate. That's a well-understood evolutionary mechanism. But it predicts that elaborate feathers should appear preferentially in structures most visible to other members of the species, and the fossil record doesn't always conform to that prediction cleanly. Some feathered dinosaurs show elaborate structures in locations that seem poorly positioned for display, which suggests either that the display hypothesis is incomplete or that the animals were using the feathers in ways the fossils can't reveal. But the deepest problem is sequence. To understand how feathers went from one function to an aerodynamic surface, it's necessary to know in what order the different feather types appeared and in what ecological context each new form emerged. The Liaoning fossils provided an extraordinary sample, but the sample is not evenly distributed across time. It represents a particular window from a particular region under particular preservation conditions. What happened in the periods and regions not represented in that sample is, for now, inference rather than evidence. What the fossil record now shows is that feathers had a long functional history before any dinosaur ever left the ground. The earliest confirmed feathered dinosaurs were entirely terrestrial. Sinosauropteryx, found in China and dated to around 130 million years ago, had simple filamentous feathers covering its body and was built for ground-level movement. There is no indication it could fly or glide. The feathers appear to have functioned primarily as insulation, keeping a warm-blooded or partially warm-blooded body at a stable temperature in an environment where overnight temperatures dropped significantly. Display came next, or possibly alongside insulation. Many feathered dinosaurs show evidence of colored or patterned feathers concentrated on the head, arms, or tail, locations that would be most visible to other members of the same species. Signaling behavior, evolved for mate selection or territorial communication, appears to have been a significant driver of feather complexity long before any aerodynamic function was possible. The feathers got more elaborate because elaborate feathers conveyed information, not because elaborate feathers helped anyone fly. Flight itself, when it finally appeared, was likely a gradual transition through gliding, animals leaping between branches or descending from height, with feathered arms providing increasing amounts of lift and control over many generations. The bird in flight is not the purpose feathers were built for. It is the result of millions of years of incremental change. A structure that began as insulation was refined for display and eventually, in one particular lineage, became the tool that made sustained flight possible. The wing came last. Feathers began as insulation and became a display structure long before they became wings. The wing came last, the final use of something that had already been developing for millions of years for entirely different reasons. That sequence matters because it means the transition from non-avian dinosaur to bird wasn't a sudden leap. It was gradual, layered, and built from structures that already existed for other purposes entirely. The impact 66 million years ago left behind a sequence of consequences that the clean version of the story doesn't fully account for. And the part of the extinction that most people don't know about is the part that happened after. The Chicxulub impact is the most well-known mass extinction event in Earth's history, and for good reason. An asteroid struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago with a force that reshaped the planet's surface, altered the atmosphere, and ended the ecological dominance of an entire class of animals that had held that dominance for over 160 million years. The event left a geological signature so distinct that scientists can identify the exact sediment layer it produced at sites across the world. A thin band of iridium, an element rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids, that marks the boundary between the Cretaceous and the period that followed. The story most people carry is a clean one. The asteroid hit and the dinosaurs died. The speed and totality of that framing makes intuitive sense. An event of that magnitude, striking with that force, should have produced immediate and total consequences. The films tend to reinforce the image: a fireball, darkness, and then silence. It is a satisfying narrative because it has a clear cause and a clear effect separated by very little time. But the fossil record, when examined in detail at the layers immediately above and below the impact boundary, tells a more complicated story. Not all dinosaur species disappear at exactly the same geological moment. The pattern of extinction isn't uniform across regions, and some species that appear above the boundary, meaning they survive the initial event, still disappear within the layers that follow, leaving behind the question of what exactly finished what the asteroid started. But the survival of some lineages past the impact boundary raises a question that the clean version of the extinction story doesn't have to answer. What, specifically, determined which species survived the initial event and which didn't? Geography played a role. Proximity to the impact zone produced immediate destruction that left no survivors. But among species far enough from the impact to avoid the direct effects, the pattern of survival and death doesn't follow an obvious rule. Some large-bodied species appear to have persisted briefly. Some smaller species didn't make it past the boundary at all. The factors that separated survivors from casualties in those first hours and days are not fully understood. But the post-impact world presented a different problem from the impact itself. The immediate destruction was concentrated and violent. What followed was slower and in some ways harder to survive. A sustained period during which conditions had been interrupted at a level affecting every living thing on the planet, regardless of how far from the impact zone it happened to be. An animal that survived the impact, they faced a world that had been altered at a level no individual adaptation could fully compensate for. But the fossil record at the extinction boundary is itself incomplete in ways that complicate the picture. The resolution of the geological record, how precisely the sediment layers can be dated, is not fine enough to determine whether species that appear above the impact boundary survived for days, years, or decades after the event. What looks like survival in the fossil record could represent a lineage that persisted for a week after the impact, or one that held on for several thousand years before finally failing. The difference between those two scenarios matters enormously for understanding what the extinction actually was, and the sediment can't yet tell them apart. What the extinction record shows is that the Chicxulub impact was the trigger, not the entirety, of what ended the non-avian dinosaurs. The impact itself, a rock estimated at 6 miles across, striking the Yucatan Peninsula at roughly 45,000 miles per hour, released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear warheads, and threw enough material into the upper atmosphere to block sunlight globally within days. The immediate destruction across North America and surrounding regions was total. But the species that survived the initial event, particularly those far enough from the impact zone to avoid the direct thermal pulse and debris fall, did not simply recover. What followed was a collapse of photosynthesis on a global scale. Without sunlight reaching the surface for months, possibly years, plant life failed. Herbivores that depended on plants starved. Predators that depended on herbivores starved after them. The food chain didn't break at one link. It failed from the bottom up, and the failure cascaded through every ecosystem on the planet, regardless of how far from the impact those ecosystems were. Species that had survived the asteroid itself had nowhere left to go once the ecological web they depended on was gone. Some dinosaur lineages appear in the fossil record in layers dated just above the impact boundary, evidence they persisted, briefly, into the aftermath. But the post-impact world couldn't sustain large-bodied animals that required significant caloric intake to survive. The extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs was not a single catastrophic moment, but a drawn-out biological failure that played out over years, possibly decades. A world slowly going quiet, long after the sky had cleared. Some dinosaurs survived the initial impact. They held on in the aftermath, in a world that had been altered at every level, and then disappeared anyway. Not from the force of the asteroid, but from the slow failure of everything the asteroid left behind. That is where the non-avian dinosaur story ends. But it is not where the dinosaur story ends. The lineage that survived the extinction didn't merely persist. It went on to become one of the most successful vertebrate groups in the history of life on Earth. What that lineage is, and how close it sits to everything that came before it, is the last thing this story has to say. The word extinction carries a particular weight when applied to dinosaurs. It implies a complete ending, a lineage that ran its course, left its fossils, and closed out. When people say the dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago, there is usually an unspoken assumption underneath that statement, that the story ended there, that the Mesozoic closed like a book, and that what followed was an entirely new chapter written by entirely different animals. Birds don't typically enter that mental picture at the extinction boundary. They appear later, separately, as modern creatures that share distant ancestry with dinosaurs, in the way that most vertebrates share distant ancestry with something older. The relationship feels loose, ancestral in the vague sense that all life traces back to common origins. A sparrow looks nothing like a velociraptor. A penguin looks nothing like an allosaurus. The visual distance between a living bird and a fossilized theropod is wide enough that the connection tends to feel more metaphorical than literal. The formal classification tells a different story. Taxonomy, the science of organizing living things into categories based on shared ancestry, doesn't sort by appearance. It sorts by lineage. And when the lineage of modern birds is traced back through the fossil record, it doesn't pass through some loose ancestral connection that most people casually assume. It arrives somewhere much closer to the museum floor than that, a conclusion with specific anatomical evidence behind it, and consequences for what the word extinction actually means when applied to this lineage. But the closeness of that relationship is precisely what makes it difficult to absorb. The problem isn't a lack of evidence. The anatomical evidence connecting modern birds to theropod dinosaurs is extensive. specific, and has been accumulating for decades. The problem is that the connection is counterintuitive in a way that factual evidence alone doesn't easily overcome. A chicken in a farmyard does not look like a dinosaur. The visual gap between the two is wide enough that accepting the formal classification as literally true, not metaphorically, not ancestrally, but taxonomically, requires overriding a strong perceptual impression with an abstract categorization. Most people never quite complete that override, but the implications of completing it are stranger than they might first appear. If birds are dinosaurs, then the extinction 66 million years ago did not end a lineage. It pruned it. The surviving lineage went on to diversify into more species than currently exist among all mammals combined, colonizing every continent and every major habitat type on the planet. The group that popular culture treats as a cautionary tale about extinction is, in terms of species count and geographical range, one of the most geographically widespread and species-rich vertebrate groups in the history of life on Earth. But what the Harvard chicken embryo research revealed is that the continuity between living birds and their Mesozoic ancestors isn't only taxonomic, it's active, biological, and closer than the physical distance between a sparrow and a theropod would suggest. The gap between a modern bird and its dinosaur ancestors is, at the level of developmental biology, smaller than the forms themselves imply. What that active biological continuity means for how the lineage should be understood, and for what the word extinction actually describes when applied to it, is where the science becomes genuinely unsettling. What formal classification now confirms is that the bird on a fence post is not a creature that descended from dinosaurs in some loose ancestral sense. It is a dinosaur, categorized within the theropod lineage, sharing more anatomical features with Velociraptor and T-Rex than either of those animals share with a crocodile. The hollow bones that make flight energetically possible are the same adaptation found across the theropod lineage. The air sac respiratory system that gives birds their extraordinary endurance is a direct inheritance from non-avian theropods. The brooding behavior documented in nesting oviraptor fossils. Adults, positioned over eggs in the same posture modern birds use, connects living species to animals that died 66 million years ago in a single unbroken behavioral line. Chickens in particular share so much skeletal architecture with T-Rex that researchers at Harvard were able to reverse certain developmental genes in chicken embryos and produce skeletal structures resembling those of their dinosaur ancestors. The genetic instructions for building dinosaur anatomy were not deleted by evolution. They were suppressed, switched off during development, but still present in the genome, waiting. Roughly 10,000 species of birds are alive today on every continent, in every climate, from Arctic tundra to equatorial rainforest. The extinction 66 million years ago did not end the dinosaurs. It ended the non-avian dinosaurs, and even that ending was incomplete, slow, and contested by species that held on longer than the simple story suggests. Every bird that has ever landed on a branch is a theropod dinosaur, and the Mesozoic, in that sense, never fully ended. If you'd like to keep exploring, there's more waiting on this channel. Subscribe so the next one finds you.